Welcome everyone to today's All Convener webinar. I believe we've got some others joining us as well, so we've got a great turnout, so thank you. I recognize that it's kind of the end of the summer. A lot of people are trying to get their last minute holidays together, but it's great that people are able to join us. So today's webinar is titled From Bandaids to Bridges, Putting Community into Food Security. And really we're talking about this as Canada releases its first ever national food policy as a roadmap for a healthier and more sustainable food system. And it's a really great opportunity to be able to look at some local examples of what communities are doing. So I'm very pleased to have Jill Umbach who is the Planning Network Coordinator with Bruce Gray Poverty Reduction Task Force. Jill has over 35 years of experience working at local, national, and international levels, focusing on poverty, community and women's empowerment, human rights, advocacy and policy development, and humanitarian needs response. Joining her today is Laura Needham, a dietitian with the Public Health Unit and chair of Food Security Action Group in Bruce Gray. I believe Jill might have some of her other colleagues on board for the call, but I'll let Jill take it over for the presentation and introduce any others who may want to jump in as well. So over to you, Jill.
Great, thanks, Elle. Hannah, do you want to remove my makeup face? That's wonderful. From Band-Aids to Bridges is how we in Grey Bruce are looking at how we pull things together and move from our current status of food aid charity models and how do we bridge that and move forward. So next slide, Hannah. So just a little background. We formed the Food Security Action Group in 2013, and it was one of the first groups that we pulled together as a pillar for our poverty task force. And the first step in the traditional way, you pull a group together and you determine what the terms of reference would be. And we realized that the people that we had around the table were so varied in their own respective work. We had people like Laura come on at a slightly later stage, but we had dietitians, we had policymakers, we had food producers, we had agriculturalists, we had churches, we had agencies, we had food banks. And so our first collective action really was to develop the Bruce Gray Food Charter for us to even understand what is food security. Let alone how would we tackle it and respond to it. And so since 2013, the Food Charter has been a key component of one of our actions towards bridging the knowledge around what is food security. And it's, as we all know, hopefully around the table, it is greater than just talking about food. And so there was a lot of social justice aspects. There was a lot of the social determinants of health discussions. There was discussions around affordable housing. Obviously, income is a priority. So our Bruce Gray Food Charter, when we initially started, was something that we felt was a policy document that we could take to our municipalities to talk about food security in each of their communities. The next slide, please, Hannah. So a lot of what we generated in the beginning and how we strategically moved forward was looking at the community food center model and understanding what that was, but also looking at, as I said, a lot of the other aspects, whether it be health, education, food literacy, economic development, social justice, culture. So this is actually a slide with a infographic that we used last year in the election, the municipal elections, as an education tool. So despite having in 2013 done a lot of extensive work and education with 17 municipalities, around food security. What is it? Where do we need to move? How do we need to transition people? And also, where is the social justice around food? We also found that once again in 2018, we were refreshing our look and articulating a little bit more specifically about how we wanted to work and move our communities around food aid. So for those of you who are not familiar, community food centers support action to strengthen the local ability to contribute and connect with individuals and groups, and to create a really vibrant local economy around food. And increasing social capital was a critical factor. One of our key aspects of this is also around our community voices. We have a community voices that are very centered to how we talk. These are people with grounded expertise or people with who are living with experiences of using food banks and of community food centers. One of our biggest challenges is that we did apply when the Canadian Food Centres Canada was offering grants. We applied and found that we have 21 food banks in our area, and it would be extremely difficult to get the population up to a really good size to work with them on a centralized community food center. So what we're presenting today is really the bits and pieces that we've culled together when you don't get funding from Canada Community Food Centres. However, we do still have a concerted effort to work with all of our food banks in the area and to transition them as much as possible. So adaptive, creative funding models is how we work. And this infographic that we've pulled together was part of that to gain support from the municipalities, 17 of them we work with, for community food center models. And we're not there. We don't have a community food center per se in our area, but we are recognizing that we need to move towards something that encompasses all of these aspects: health, social justice, culture, education, food literacy, economic development, if we are to move forward to bridge that. And as I've already indicated, we recognize that an increase in income is critical to be able to afford healthy food, to be able to afford housing, transportation, and all things that are tied to food security. Next slide, please. So our rural reality where we are, we're in 2 counties, Grey County and Bruce County. We have 21 food banks across the way. So on this very small map, we run from Tobermory all the way down to just the border with Huron and Wellington counties. 20% of our households are food insecure in our area. We do have a traditional charity model, and we have, an incredible groups of volunteers and committed community members that are really doing the Band-Aid emergency food aid. We have a rural population of 180,000 across 2 counties, very scattered and quite obvious hard to serve areas. We have no public transportation, and not all our food banks report to Feed Ontario Hunger Map or to others. So we don't have a mandated way of reporting on food insecurity in our area. And as I stated already, our food banks are largely run by volunteers. So we appreciate and support the volunteers, but it's a large ship that we are looking at with a huge geographic area to transition. Next slide. So with the leadership of the United Way, we have started, prior to the formation of our poverty task force, we used to hold food bank summits, is what we called them. And at that point, the United Way was encouraging local food banks to contribute their data and come together to create what we call the Hunger Report. And so every 2 years, they would do a survey and get them to report in, and then we'd get a local idea. A large number of a small number of our very big food banks do report to the larger association of food banks, but the smaller ones don't. So we really wanted to capture what was happening. So every 2 years, the United Way would take a survey, and then in 2011, they began doing summits where they brought all the food banks together and started talking about issues. And this is where we started to introduce community food gardens. We started introducing how to handle fresh produce contributions and transitioning. You'll see that it was United Way, and then in 2015, the Poverty Task Force supported the United Way in carrying out the survey. And at that time, we started also to engage with more people from our community voices. So we started to transition from just talking about the logistics of a traditional charity model and encouraging them with new ideas to actually in 2015, it was actually technically 2016 when we had the summit. The report was produced in 2015. We brought in the community food center in Parkdale in Ottawa for a full presentation and engagement. At that time, we also had our community voices, which was people with lived experience sitting at the table. And that was the first time we had food bank clients, users, sit down and engage and work on potential solutions and moving forward with them. Next slide. So what we've transitioned from the traditional charity model in many of our communities is we've transitioned now into what we call food security roundtables. And part of that is that we are now shifting the conversations to a larger audience and engagement with the whole community around food security. So our conversations started initially because another aspect of our food security action group is knowing who is doing what where. And so we wanted to do more activities around community food gardens, around community food kitchens, around storage and transportation of produce, fresh produce. And we didn't have a general idea of what was going on every part of the two counties. So we started with a food security asset map. And the best way to get the information was to sit down and have some of these food security roundtable conversations. So initially we were just trying to pull information from people, and then we realized, there's so much more going on in terms of the conversation, and so much to be learned around what is food security and how is it in a specific community, what assets are there, and then what collaborative joint work could we be doing with them. So what started off as getting a little bit more information, changing up the dynamics, having the users of the food banks come into these food security roundtables. We always update the food security asset map, and we look at pulling things together around partners. One of the partners that we did pull in, if you will, or they came in with us as part of all of these conversations, was the Grey Bruce Sustainability Network. So when they joined our food security action group, we also saw a lot more synergy in the work that we were doing. So we started off, as I said, with food bank summits. And then in 2018, with our partnership with the Grey Bruce Sustainability Network, we transitioned those into fall food gatherings. So our fall food gatherings move us into different conversations. So it's just not all about the food banks now. It's also how do we work more and more with producers, community food gardens, and other service providers. We also saw our community voices taking a larger role. And as part of this as well, we're able to bring more best practices and to have a larger conversation around some of the ideas that the community food center model brings to the table. So we still haven't gotten funding from the community food centers Canada, but we have reached out, and in partnership we'll be working with them to look at best practices at this particular fall food gathering in September. The other aspect that Laura and the team have been working on is our food rescue, our partnership with foodrescue.ca. So we're still building that in terms of our food banks and our donors to look at that. We are also, with the Grey Bruce Sustainability Network, looking at a lot of the food waste diversion. And all of this is built up to create a platform by which we can engage with more of our policy and decision makers, as well as our leaders in the communities. So we were lucky that we got a grant this year from the United Way to do 5 food security roundtables and also to fund our fall food gathering. And so our key speakers will be from the local in Stratford Community Food Center and foodrescue.ca. We've got a lot more emphasis as well for grocers and producers on food waste diversion. And then we will be talking about what everybody is doing across the 2 counties. One aspect that happens in a lot of our rural communities and in smaller communities is that we do provide technical expertise, but we also draw from a best practice in a local community. So we have smaller communities that are actually are doing some fantastic work. And so we work with them to do best practices. Locally, everybody likes to see that it's somebody doing this locally, and they like to know that it's adaptable and will work with their community. Also, geographically, that things that are being grown or produced are also being able to do so in their own community gardens. Our Second Harvest program started off in Meaford. It was one of the first projects that the Food Security Action Group did right after getting the charter endorsed. Meaford is a leading area for us. They have huge apple orchards and a large amount of fruit trees and fruit production there. So we were able to do a lot of Second Harvest programming, and that still continues with the Golden Town outreach. So we really do benefit from a lot of the food banks who are already transitioning themselves into more of a community food center model. We're physically not in one location though. So even an example in Golden Town outreach is they may use a kitchen there in one location for processing, but they may work with the schools on gardens. And so we geographically, I don't think in Grey Bruce we'll ever have one location with everything in it. But we will be in the places where people gather. So next slide. So the objectives, and I've just thrown up a couple of slides around our community food conversations and the roundtable. So the objectives really are to strengthen the network of food security stakeholders and service providers to move towards a hub model, share regional initiatives, food rescue, Grey County Agri-Food Asset Map. We talk about our food charter, and we invite everybody to an annual fall food gathering. We discuss in the roundtable conversations services, resource needs, service gaps, and what other issues are currently affecting attendees' programs. So one of the key things that is coming up overarching has been housing. Affordable housing impacts on your ability to have money left over to purchase food or access food. Transportation, precarious work. So it's interesting that when we go to have a food security roundtable conversation, we can spend the first hour just talking about affordable housing or the lack of jobs for people in a specific area, which is then, of course, impacting their food security. Some people think you're just going to come and talk about food security and see people that are food insecure. But what we do also see is a lot of people coming to the table to be educated on what poverty looks like in our area. One of the stigmas around food banks and around being food insecure is a lot of people don't speak up about it. A lot of people we know statistically are not going to the food bank. And a lot of people would not consider themselves food insecure. So a lot of that conversation is around understanding that and addressing that. Point D here is around taking action. So coming out of each of our food security conversations, we identify local action projects what's the next step for that specific community, whether it be a cooking program, community garden upgrade. In some cases, a lot of it is going back, because the municipal, going back to talk about the policies and the positions. Sometimes some of the groups are at a position where we are talking about the food policy for Canada, and what would a nutritious school program, if it was funded across and we had hot meal programs in our communities, what impact would that have? And in other cases, it's talking about how do we work with students, perhaps around food literacy. And so that's quite a lot of what we do. So it can range. Sometimes we have mayors and deputy mayors sitting at those conversations, and we move into the whole realm of how the government funds or supports programs around food waste diversion. So we can have some meaningful dialogue there. Next slide. So this is just, again, sharing in with the slides. This was our funding that we got this year, and I think I've spoken to a lot of it. We had a full-time consultant actually work with us, which was fantastic, to allow her to go out. Building relations is a critical aspect of what we need to do when we're talking about transitioning from a traditional food charity model for food banks. Kimberly Edwards was our coordinator, and a large part of what she was doing was engaging with people, as well as providing facilitation skill when we had our conversations, follow-up, and technical resources and funding information. So we just don't go in and have a conversation and leave. We build those relations for short-term, medium-term, and even long-term relations. Next slide. So Ellie was asking about some of the challenges and successes around that. And so one of the key things was we did do a full application for community food center models, and we were unsuccessful. And one of the reasons why they said was low population density. And so what do we do when we have low population density? The amount of money that we have to put into and invest in programming is very high for the number of people that will benefit. And so when we get into population density analysis of, is this good bang for your buck? We tend to lose out because we don't have the high population. But equitably, we do deserve to have similar programming. So that is one of the reasons why we will be working with the community food centers and their speakers in this fall. It's also another reason why we're chatting around their good food organizations. And I think that's a wonderful aspect. If you get a chance to look that up, good food organizations is that support when you're transforming and moving along your model, if you will, from a charity model to a community food center model. We are successful in that our Bruce Gray Agri-Food asset map. When we initially started, we had a small, very user-friendly map, which only showed our data, so it was really quick and easy to search. We were fortunate in that Gray County, their GIS people offered and contributed their services to help us set up the map, and we continued to populate it. We are now merged, however, with a Bruce Gray Agri-Food asset map. And so we kind of get lost in all the trees and the food producers and things like that. So it's a little bit more difficult, but we're still working with them. Another challenge and success we have is that our community gardens and community kitchens, those are something that are very, very popular, easy to undertake, and we have a lot of available green space, and we have a lot of certified kitchens throughout. And as I mentioned earlier, they might not all be in one central hub, but they are in one community. So for example, the town of Tobermory at the tip of the Bruce Peninsula has a population of 3,000 people. They have a community food center, a model that they're transitioning to. However, they recognize that they don't have the funds to build a commercial kitchen and have it certified. So they use a certified church kitchen down the road. So we're used to traveling in our area. People don't expect everything to be found in one hub. So a town of 3,000, you might find 4 or 5 pieces together. The important part is the engagement they have with people with low income to be part of and running things. And that's a big transformation that we've been working on with them. Food security education is ongoing. We are constantly having to refresh and to remind, and every new municipal election means there are different people sitting on various councils who have perhaps a narrow model of what food security is and how to address food security. So Laura and I, will be back to Bruce County as a whole, and that's a council as a whole, speaking to them again about the Bruce Gray Food Charter, which has the values and the principles, but also gives us an opportunity to expand the dialogue around food security. So it's one tool in our toolbox of things to go back out and layer the education around food security. What is it? Food waste diversion. We have a lot of education going on, and certainly it is a key thing that's happening on the national level in discussions. We still need to balance the discussions around doing that with the ability to store and process food. So a lot of our food banks, however much they would like to be doing it, and still have a challenge with creating the spaces and putting in refrigeration and being able to have enough volunteers to work with people to look at processing food waste. So those are some of the things that we've been looking at. I think the question for me always is what to do when you don't get the big money to be able to hire people or to have a central location to do it all together. So we have to pick out pieces within each of the communities we work with. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. I think some of the key things is that moving towards a model takes leadership for change. And that's one of the key reasons why we are talking about the food charter and food security with our policy and decision makers and our funders. And at the same time, we are working with the volunteers and the people that use these services for innovative solutions. And quite honestly, they do a lot of the work. They do almost all of the work that demonstrates that this is the way to go. So without that leadership, we may get a food bank that decides, no, they're just going to stick with the charity model. So we have chosen, and we work with them and support them any way we can. And at the same time, we show them some of the best practices that are being generated locally and the leadership that's there locally as well. Ensure free technical support for food banks in transition is available. So that's been a critical one as well. And having hired our coordinator for our food security conversations, we've had 2 now, who have been able to technically provide support, for example, on how to set up community gardens. It's not just the physical setup from a gardening standpoint, but it's also how do you organize your community groups and what do you need to have in place in order to manage it. Bringing in community voices, which is our people with lived experience, is uncomfortable for a lot of the food banks. They don't necessarily want to have any criticism. We recognize that it's a charity model, and therefore there's lots of volunteers. But changes in the room can be really brought about in a dynamic way when we have a relationship built, a relationship of mutual respect between someone using the center and somebody who is delivering or servicing the center. And so that power dynamic is really at the crux of what a community food center is all about. And so we really want that dynamic to change. And again, it goes back to leadership of the food bank and how we go it. And we've gone leaps and bounds with some community food banks, really going far, and others, it might take a while for the leadership change. But our community voices are integral to that change. And then layering programming in community hubs. So we also use a lot of the Bridges Out of Poverty training and programming to work with our food bank volunteers and members and leaders to look at how we can change up the power dynamics. We offer Getting Ahead in a lot of the same communities where we also do our community food security conversations. And Getting Ahead is a program that we offer for 8 weeks for people that are on Ontario Works or ODSP. And we find that they usually move from individual focus to community advocacy, and then our community food security conversations gives them an opportunity to also participate and come to the table and talk about their challenges in their specific community. And once again, we're building relationships of mutual respect, and we're trying to change up the power dynamics. We go to the next slide. We can go with some Q&A now, or we can take us straight into food policy for Canada. What do you think, Al? Ellie?
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Thank you so much, Jill. That was really interesting and really insightful from a local level. I think at this point we can open it up for questions, and then we will open it up for more discussion on the next slides around your take on the Canada's food policy and more discussion. But first, we can start with any questions for Jill and her team, Jill and Laura, and anyone else who's on board. Feel free to send some questions in the chat box, or unmute yourself and jump in.
Hi, Jill. This is Raymond. I'm pretty new in this game, but I was very interested to hear that that dynamic with food banks, that uncomfortable, when there's other voices or other input, that's not abnormal. So maybe not so much a question as a comment, just to say it's good to hear that, because I think that's one thing that we experience in our region as well. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that, what is a good way to approach those conversations with food banks, because you don't want to come in and say, hey, well, this hasn't been working, so we want to try to do something different, which, these are often volunteers who have dedicated lots of time and energy to making these things happen. So
you name it. And you definitely don't want to alienate anybody in your community who is contributing and trying to find solutions.
Yeah.
I once did a talk with a group of a lot of those ladies and gentlemen. I still call them my church ladies, and I love them to death. But at the same time, trying to understand the dynamics around, getting a food handout is a very difficult and not a dignified way sometimes for people. And getting that understanding was really trying to find opportunities to build relationships. And that's why that layering of programming is really, really important. Yeah. When we did Bridges Out of Poverty with the food bank members and volunteers, it gave us the space to open up and ask all the awkward questions and to build some relations with the people at our community voices, so that they know that they're not just going to get attacked or criticized, or they feel that people are ungrateful. But I think there is a lot of power dynamics in that sense of, I am giving you something, you should be grateful. And how we work with people is really, really critical. And so we have progressed from food banks sitting there and receiving our lectures. And I think in the beginning, people felt very much like they were getting a lecture on what they were doing wrong. And we have transitioned and learned over the years and built the relationships, especially since our food banks sit at our Food Security Action Group, and many of our community voices come to those meetings. So you have a chance to build a relationship, which is outside of being the client and somebody servicing you. And so slowly we've transitioned that thought. Not everybody has that. We have some people that just say, nope, I'm just prepared to collect tin goods and have it available. And that's the emergency need. And I'm just going to meet that need. But we've used other tools with them to understand. When we developed the food charter, we actually had it reviewed at a food bank summit by all the food banks. And they gave us feedback on it. So a lot of that is engaging them to take the leadership. When we have a food bank like the Golden Town Outreach transition ahead of the others, or like the food forests and the community gardens from CMHA, we see that people are transitioning and leading in their own communities, so that it's not necessarily the Poverty Task Force saying, oh, we need to go this way. We are seeing the leadership come up in so many different communities that we are highlighting what they're doing. And so people are less, they're not getting a lecture from the Poverty Task Force, they're sharing ideas with a neighbor. The other aspect I would say as well is that last year at our fall food gathering, we actually invited CMHA in because our food banks were talking about mental health. And they were having so many people coming in and having a mental health experience during the time when they're just supposed to be handing out food. And they realized that a lot of the volunteers and the staff in the food banks were not equipped to deal with mental health experiences. And a lot of clients, customers, people in the community were coming in, and they were not staying from 9 to 5. They were 5 o'clock still there, and they didn't have housing, and they didn't have a place to go. And the food bank didn't know how to refer them to any of these services for after hours. So we ended up having a full day workshop with CMHA, specifically meeting some of the needs and being able to ask all the awkward questions. What do I do when somebody comes in, and, you know, how do I handle that? I'm just supposed to be a volunteer handing out food, and here suddenly I'm dealing and working with somebody with a mental health experience. So we are listening as well to what the needs are of the food banks and where they are on their pathway to transitioning.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jill.
Thanks. Thank you, Raymond. Okay, I am going to read a couple of questions in the chat box that have come up. So one is from Emily Hun. She's stating, Emily says, our community is looking at starting a food security food system task force. One of our main goals will be to develop a food charter. You had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about food charters. Did you have a hand in developing the one for Bruce Gray? And if so, could you speak a bit more on how to begin about developing one and what resources you used?
Okay, I had a hand in developing it, but so did Laura. So Laura Needham, not mine personally, but the co-chair of our Food Security Action Group. Maybe Laura, are you still on the line? Can I ask you to speak to that?
Sure, I can jump in on that one.
Yeah.
So that was basically the first activity I got involved in as co-chair with the Food Security Action Group. So we did have this group that, you know, was kind of a mismatch of different stakeholders and no clear vision of what we were going to do. So what we started with was some research of food charters in Ontario and in other communities, mostly Canada and the US. And from there, we were able to just pull out the pieces that we felt applied best to Grey Bruce. Following this draft document that we came up with from our research, and our knowledge of our local community, we then brought it out for consultation. So that was a couple different steps. There was the first step of targeted consultation, where we were going out to the stakeholders we knew of or knew well, definitely knew would have a voice. And then after that, there was a broader public consultation where it's just absolutely anyone could get involved with giving us some feedback on the food charter. I think the consultation period in total would have lasted, I think, a year and a half or so. It was quite a long time to develop that. So it was basically research and then 2 stages of consultation, bringing that feedback together and coming up with a final document. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Laura. Hopefully that does. Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. We can always just, oh, yes, thank you, says Emily. So it does. Anyway, we can always follow up with some further, if there's some follow-up needed for some of these questions as well via email afterwards. So I'll speak to Don Kettler's message here. He's got a message or a question in the chat box. It is, do you find that you need to explain what food security is and food insecurity? So I guess food security is not the same as food insecurity. I see the term food security being used in my community for farmers markets and community garden projects with no or limited access to people in low income. That's a good point.
Absolutely, yes. We're always clarifying the two terms in every single document, in every single presentation or chance to communicate with someone else. That pretty much inevitably comes up. So yes, that is a constant struggle.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Laura said is that that refresh all the time, and even when you feel like, oh, we've already had this conversation, then somebody gets off on a different, we have to refresh it a lot. So since 2013, when we started, we're now 2019, I find that we are now back in another cycle of having to refresh it. And we've, when in Ontario, there's been changes with the Ontario Poverty Reduction Strategy being archived. What are we talking about now with food security, right? So there's so many other aspects that we have to do. We have a new member of parliament. Our MPPs are Bill Walker and Lisa Thompson. And so just currently we're having to have another conversation with them about what does food security mean. And to also understand that a lot of the data we collect in this area is not consistent and doesn't truly reflect the numbers that we're seeing at the food banks, because not all food banks report consistently.
Sure. Thanks for that. And yeah, I mean, we do know that food bank usage, I mean, it's only a fraction of the number of people who might be classified as food insecure actually using food banks. And you're speaking to a really important comprehensive response that is required to move beyond that. And you've given lots of great examples around your collective approach, and really it's not just about food, it's about income, it's about housing, it's about transportation and employment and food literacy. And it's very important to be able to be adaptive and creative and take advantage of best practices and include a broad range of stakeholders and engagement in the community. So that's really, really important. Thank you for speaking to that. And now what we're going to do is just open up a little bit of the discussion to a bit broader. So we talked about at a local level, obviously there are going to be differences, I think, in the political context, I think, across provinces and territories. And now, Hannah, if you want to move to the next slide. We may be stalled, maybe frozen a little bit. So just to open up the discussion around, just as Canada releases its first food policy, following in the path of some other countries who have already done that. And the vision is really for all people in Canada to be able to access a sufficient amount of safe, nutritious, and culturally diverse food, and that Canada's food system is resilient and innovative and sustains our environment and supports our economy. Now, the idea is that it's a roadmap for a healthier and more sustainable food system. It's very early days right now to see how this will roll out. There are a number of priority outcomes and action areas that will be that should be actioned over the next 5 years. But I'll ask Jill to speak to, I think it's the next slide, just to speak to your response or your recommendations from a rural perspective on this one.
Okay, so we have not had a chance at our Food Security Action Group and to review the current new one, everything that was integrated, but we have highlighted a few from a rural perspective. We would like to see more of this into the action plans that come down in the next 5 years. So recognizing the unique challenges that we face in the rural area and remote and northern communities is important. And one of the critical things for us in our area, we are in a mid-zone rural, so we're not remote and we're not northern. And quite often we get lumped in with our southern colleagues, but we're really in a unique situation where we are. So for us to understand from a rural perspective is really critical. Income response that reflects the housing and transportation challenges is really necessary for us if we're going to look at I should have said is necessary for food security there. I've written food insecurity, my apologies. But you have to consider that. We have huge areas, which I'm sure all across Canada we're seeing this. Affordable housing impacts significantly on available money for purchase of food. But not only that, we're also seeing transportation challenges. We have no public transportation in our area. We have people that will spend $35 on a taxi one way to get to a food bank. Well, and so money is going towards transportation just to access food for 1 to 2 days. So we know that there's big challenges that way. An income response is the critical one that needs to happen first. Mandatory consistent data collection on food insecurity needs to happen. And as was already mentioned, we don't have that true picture of what's happening. We just know that a lot of people are food insecure. Again, that's dealing with that dignity and stigma issue as well. The right to a healthy environment, food and water, means sustaining natural food systems. So here we are in the rural areas. We have a lot of wild food sources, and we have a lot of country foods that if there are changes in Ontario, some of the protection around environment, protection around green spaces, protections for around development. Right now we have on the table government lobbyists who would like to see a lot of our greenbelt areas used up for housing development. And so they're saying, well, there's a housing crisis, therefore we must use up lands which would traditionally be protected for food and water. So there needs to be a balance there. And we're seeing it up in our area. We don't want to see the influx of sprawls of suburban areas that will then reduce our ability to generate local food. And then supporting a healthier food environment in schools. And that could be that hot meal programs, nutritious school food programs, food literacy. And then in our area particularly also is to support the viability of young farmers and food entrepreneurs. In our food security conversations recently, we've heard about farmers markets where it's very expensive to have a booth at a farmer's market. And the prices at a lot of the farmers markets are not food prices that are accessible to people with low income. It's a very much a middle class thing to go to the farmer's market and buy fresh organic produce on a Saturday morning or whenever your market is. And what we've got is a couple social entrepreneurs. Some of the community food gardens are now generating and processing food or having fresh food at subsidized prices at the farmers markets, and therefore everybody can access that from different economic strata. So these are some of our recommendations that should be considered when developing action plans.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jill, for your insight from a rural perspective, which is really, really helpful. Okay, so we have a few minutes. I thought if anyone wanted to, we can move to the next slide. I've thrown some questions out there. I think some of this has been really, Jill and Laura have been able to speak to this already, but I thought I'd open it up to see if anyone had any comments they wanted to share more broadly.
Hi, it's Lee
Hello.
here.
Hi.
It's Lee calling, or Lee piping up here.
Hello.
I'm from Elora. And Jill, I wanted to say thank you for everything that you've done. And I also want to compliment you. I know a gentleman who that has used the Tobermory Food Bank, and he has said it's the best food bank anywhere, in that it was one quick phone call and the food was delivered to the home. How many people are there? They had no access to a vehicle, and there was no stigma surrounding anything. And I think that's the important thing, that people feel comfortable. A lot of people won't, as you said, especially in rural areas. I think the dignity is very important. And I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation. And one quick question is, did you, you said a couple of times that the lived experience people were very important to, so you said at one point here, do all of the work to educate. How did you support the lived experience people to get their voice heard? What were your best practices for that?
Sure. We actually, if in partnership with Tamarack, I don't know if Hannah, you can go back to the slide with the 10 guide on it. This one. So and another group forum for Tamarack, we've actually developed this guide for including people. And this has got the best practices in it. So it's 10, and it's got 10 best practices, and it features 10 groups across Canada that have engaged with people with lived experience. We are number 10 of the 10, and they feature our community voices. So we have a model at our Poverty Task Force where people come into the Getting Ahead program for 8 weeks, and they look at assessing their individual needs, and then they look at assessing the community that they live in. And then we present that out to the people at the food bank, to the politicians, to the social workers in the area, and they get a platform to speak. We also have, like, MPP Lisa Thompson has come to Walkerton. Bill Walker has come for the last 7 years. We've been doing this program. So we've generated a large number of Getting Ahead graduates who have examined poverty in their own community, spoken to it, and then they can join our community voices. So our community voices is made up of 8 to 10 people with lived experience all across Grey Bruce. And we work with them and support them. We mentor them. They are part of our Bridges training. They deliver it with us. They co-facilitate workshops. But this is all captured in this guidebook 10, Engaging People with Lived Living Experience.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Moving to looking at the time, we've been able to fill this hour pretty well. These are some of these questions are really kind of food for thought. So things to consider for now, and perhaps we might be provide opportunity to look at this further down the road and explore as Canada's food policy kind of unravels. If you can move to the next slide, I think we've got some resources just to connect with. So Canada's healthy eating strategy. So the food policy really should align. The idea is that it aligns with Canada's already existing healthy eating strategy, which includes Canada's Food Guide and some other areas, as well as the poverty reduction strategy. So that's worth looking at. As well, a couple of sources of information if you're not already familiar with. Proof is food insecurity policy research that is part of the University of Toronto, and they do a lot of work around household food insecurity, around national measurements, and have some really good resources and publications. As well, Food Secure Canada is a great national resource. They do provide an analysis of the current food policy, so that's a really useful, provides a useful insight. Food Secure Canada has been calling for a national food policy for many years now. Community Food Centres Canada, Jill has spoken already to this model. And good food, or being a good food organization, and that is a project of Community Food Centres Canada. So really great resources, and they talk a lot around the community food center model and moving beyond charitable responses for food insecurity. Okay, and next, bear with me while I just take a few minutes to provide you with a few announcements. So upcoming opportunities, collective impact through the lens of ABCD and results-based accountability. So on October 10th, there will be a webinar you can register for on asset-based community development and results-based accountability. Next slide, we have a few opportunities for advisory councils coming up. So the first one is on this topic. It's there's a call out for people to become members of the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council. So this one, the deadline is September 20th. If you want more information, the link will be provided here, and we will send all of this information out to you as a follow-up to this call. Next, the next one is another advisory council. This one, the deadline is very soon, September 2nd. So if anyone is interested, this is to apply to become a member of the Social Innovation Advisory Council. And this is part of the Canada's Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy. So that's another call out, but the deadline is soon. The next one, it must be the time. Apply to become a member of the National Housing Council. So that you have a little bit more time for this, but this is part of the National Housing Strategy. So if anyone's interested, October 14th is the deadline for that. You can learn more. The link's provided to learn more for that. Okay, and next announcement is our next convener call. That is in a couple weeks, September 10th, and we will be covering the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, a discussion around the new dimensions of Poverty Hub, and we'll also be talking about our member gathering, our upcoming member gathering for October.